Hello, everyone, and welcome to Happiness in Higher Ed podcast. My name is John Hill. I use he, him pronouns, and today's guest is Eli Van Sickel. And before I actually formally introduce Eli, I just want to say this is episode 14, and I'm going to read our mission statement real quickly. So, in a world that can be engulfed in darkness, we must shine bright and lead the change for a better future. As we continue to shape and challenge emerging adults' minds, it is also our duty to reflect and remember what makes us happy and why we continue to do the work that we do. So, without further ado, here is Eli Van Sickel. And since 2019, Eli Van Sickel has been an access consultant for the Disability Resource Center at Purdue University. A native of Indiana and California, he holds a MS and college student personnel from Western Illinois University. Before that, Eli spent over 10 years in show business, receiving a BS in theater from Indiana State and an MS in theater history and theater studies from Illinois State. He has an extensive experience working for professional theater companies in Chicago and Nashville, among many other places. While Eli is hard of hearing and has worn hearing aids throughout his life, he's also an avid musician, singer, and performer. Eli's professional interests include disability and performance, academic success coaching, and graduate student development. He is a passionate fan of the Los Angeles Dodgers baseball and Purdue basketball, as well as a casual fan of Nashville Predators hockey. Would you like to add anything else, Eli?
Only that now that I listen to it, I feel like I talk too much about sports. I'm trying to, I'm always thinking about what is going to endear me to the students, but right before, if they read my bio before I meet with them. And I'm like, oh, sports. I couldn't name you one player on the Nashville Predators hockey team.
I mean, it is what it is. I mean, before we started this podcast, we talked probably for about 10, 15 minutes about baseball. So I feel like that's a part of you, you know?
Yeah, it is. Baseball, definitely more so. I just I like being able to have a starting point or something that I can relate to with anybody or any student that I'm talking to.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's why I like having moved around so much in my life. I'm when someone says where they're from, I'm like, oh, okay, so I used to visit a friend over here, and or I used to live here, and so like I like having a shared frame of reference.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I went too hard on the sports stuff. Like what am I going to say? I'm also a fan of this golfer in Western Canada. Like what? Anyway.
Hey, I mean, if it like I said, if it works for you, then I think it should go. You should go with it. So,
Right. That spoken like a true higher ed professional.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. All right. So, if it's cool with you, I'm just going to roll into the questions.
Yeah, sure.
All right. So here we go. So, what was the reason you started to pursue a career in higher education?
So it's weird how roundabout my journey into higher ed actually was, because my dad's a professor of political science, and I grew up on or around college campuses from the earliest I can remember. He was either in grad school or teaching, and so I was looking at colleges when I was in 8th grade. Like, it was just, it was part of the thinking. And it's funny, no matter, as a kid or a young adult thinking about what I wanted to pursue as a career, for some reason I always had the mindset that whatever I ultimately chose, I had to get a master's degree in it.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why I have 2 master's degrees. But so I grow up around higher ed, but I didn't really know anyone associated with the student affairs side of things. I knew professors, right?
Mm-hmm.
And academic advising is what professors do on the side at these smaller schools that don't have dedicated academic advisors in departments or whatever. And even when I was an undergrad, I didn't, I lived on campus. I was involved in things. I didn't really look into it. But in my first master's program at Illinois State in the School of Theater and Dance, I was there because I was all theater all the time. I thought I would follow that track and become a professor ultimately. But this theater department was big enough to where it had a dedicated academic advisor.
Hmm.
And I'd never seen that before. And so it sort of planted the seed. And so later on, years later, when I was sort of doing the bohemian artist lifestyle in the big city and I was getting kind of tired of it, I thought about what are some options as something something I can pursue and make a living in, something that can be my day job that's a little chunkier than just flipping burgers and driving a bus, which is what I was doing.
Hmm.
And I started thinking more about, well, I don't want to teach, but I love college. I love higher ed. I really like talking to young people and students.
Hmm.
And so from there I ended up looking into more of the jobs and looking at job listings and realizing that you needed 3 years of experience and or a master's degree. And so I was like, well, I love graduate school, so what's another master. So that's kind of how I came to higher ed, where it's like I was always gonna end up in higher ed in some way, I
Hmm.
think, on some level. It just took me a while to wrap my head around. There's the student affairs side of things that, in an ideal world, contributes to the education and development of students just as much as the work that's done in the classroom.
Hmm. Got you. Okay. And like you had mentioned too that, well, I mean, you had mentioned it, but it's also in your bio that you have two master's degrees. So what was that thought process? Were you okay with doing that at first, of going back and getting another master's, or what was that like for you?
Well, yeah, I was okay with it. The second time around, because the first time around, I had majored in theater in undergrad and I had went straight in.
Hmm.
And I was thinking, okay, I'll go straight in, I'll do my master's, I'll go straight in and get my PhD. And by the time I'm 30, I'll be a tenured professor, right? I
Hmm.
was going to do that, boom, boom, boom. And then, surprise, surprise, I hit a wall towards the second year of my master's where I was just like, done. I needed a break from school. By the time it came to seriously consider going back and getting another master's degree, and people had asked me, well, why not go like do a doctorate or do something else? Like, why another master's? And I really wanted to, if I was going to make this shift in focus, I wanted to really dip myself into the fundamentals. And there's part of that you get in a master's program that you can't really get in a doctoral program. And I'm the kind of person who, like, if I could make my living just getting master's degrees, I totally would. Like, if I could just get a master's degree in everything that I'm passionate about or interested in, that would be life for me.
Hmm.
Um, and so, because I love learning, I love school, I love the 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 differences, all the differences between a master's program or grad school and undergrad, where it's like you're closer to your professors, it's more seminar based, you get to work on campus, all this stuff I really loved. But it was just about, it was more about making the decision and really realizing, okay, I'm going to go with this. I'm going to, and it was a big deal too, because I had been focused on theater and the arts for so much of my life.
Hmm.
And the thing about people in the arts is they feel so strongly emotionally connected that it's really not a career. It's about the passion. And I get that there are people in other disciplines that have that same connection, but in the arts you cannot escape it.
Hmm.
And so I went through a real tough period of deciding that I was going to set that part of my life aside and focus intently on something else. Once I knew that I wanted to do that, then it was an easy decision and it was just about finding the right program.
Got you. Okay. Nice. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. So then, this is a loaded question. So what makes you happy? One thing from higher ed and then one personal thing.
Yeah. I I guess we'll start with a personal thing. I really, I have a lot of creative interests that I still pursue at varying levels. The theater making part of me is never going to go away. I like writing scripts and
Mhm.
poetry. I love playing music and singing. I'm getting into photography now. Like I like having a lot of different um interests and passions of things that drive me.
Mhm.
Um and and because I like being able to do a lot of different things and talk semi intelligently about a lot of different things.
Okay.
Being a very well-rounded multidimensional person in that respect really makes me happy. In terms of the work, I it's part of why I admire you so much for starting this kind of podcast, because especially in the last year and a half in student affairs, all I've been thinking about is the challenges.
Mhm.
Um and the things that I have to do the work to mitigate or to fix, or I have to press on in spite of whatever. I guess it's uh, the most immediate thing, or the most recent thing I can think of, is knowing that I'm working with people who who share the same worldview as me, or the same opinions about the work that we're specifically doing.
Mhm.
Feeling that I'm really part of a team in that way really makes me happy, and also really gives me a lot of fuel for addressing all of the challenges that we're constantly facing in higher ed.
Got you. Yeah. No, that totally makes a lot of sense. And it kind of leads us into the next question, because I mean it has been a challenging. I mean, if you the past 17, 18 months, if you have not had any challenges, I good for you. Good
Well,
for you.
yeah, well, and especially we're in a world, an industry where it's people facing, and it's about putting up. It's kind of like all my friends in show business who had to close down their shows and companies and not like the performing arts is literally about getting a bunch of people in a room and together.
Mhm.
And it's kind of the same way in terms of education, or what we traditionally think of as higher education, is having a bunch of people on a big college campus and in classrooms and gymnasiums and football stadiums and all this stuff.
Yeah, no, you're not wrong. And I think that as we were approaching this newfound sense of more uncertainty, I guess is the best way to put it. I think it's something to think about as when we do decide to like make changes, make policy, and to reflect on that.
Yeah.
Um, so
Do you think that if we do go back to a shutdown, you know, heaven forbid, do you think that do you think that you would be better prepared for it? Or do you think that you'll do something differently? Or is it kind of like you would still be flying by the seat of your pants just the same way?
This we are 13 episode. This is episode 14. We're 13 episodes in, and this is the first time someone has asked me a question. I think that has someone has asked me a question outright. And
Into podcasting. You think that this can at a time you're not answering anything. Now we're getting into podcast. Next thing you know, by like episode 30, this is gonna be like a 4-hour episode.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think it's going to depend upon the state of reality. And I say that very vaguely because I think for me, someone that's worked as a health promotion specialist for the past 3 years and has an extensive background in health and wellness, I think it's one of those things that I've continued to do the things that, like, the coping strategies, and when I feel down, or like when I'm having a bad day, like I've continued to do those things over the past 18 months and previous before that. So I think that if we were ever to come into a state where we had to go back to shutting down, or a condensed version of that, whatever that may be, depending upon where you're at, state wise, I think I would be okay until like the work piece came into it, because I think that a lot of a Zoom, like we're sitting over Zoom right now, and I think that there's nothing wrong with Zoom, but I think last year sitting on it for literally everything that we did, it's a different type of taxing on you as a person. I would be doing work from home, and then I would have a meeting, and I'd be like, having like this epiphany type situation where I was like, I really want to be on this. I really want to meet these people, and I really want to talk about all these things, but it's over Zoom. There's a different type of different norm when we have conversations over Zoom. And I think that even though we're a year into it, like a couple weeks ago, I muted myself and then tried to speak. And then someone was like, oh, you need to unmute yourself. And I was like, oh, we're a year into this. So
Yeah.
I think it's different. So I think it's going to depend upon the person, as well as your state of where you're at with, I guess, the acceptance of that potential thing happening.
Yeah, and I think you hit on something where it kind of depends on the nature of the work. Like even if we're just talking about within the context of higher education, like something I've learned so much in my 2+ years at Purdue. And I had the benefit in my graduate assistantship of really being um, sort of knee deep in the work of disability services anyway. But I've learned so much being a real professional.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I've learned is that in this particular line of work, the only time I meet with students is when they're asking when there's a problem, usually. When they're about to come to campus and they're anticipating these accessibility barriers, or when they're on campus and they are noticing accessibility barriers. Um, or they think that they're experiencing accessibility barriers, and it doesn't necessarily rise to the level of needing an accommodation.
Mm-hmm.
Either way, all of it is, those are my relationships with students. I don't really hear about the successes. I hear about the challenges and the barriers. And my God, during a pandemic, a year-long pandemic, it's that just it emphasized the challenges, the accessibility challenges even more. And so I was really
Mm-hmm.
glad to be the work that I was doing. But if I'm thinking about the possibility of, going back to a shutdown and there was an unofficial mental health pandemic among college age students already
Mm-hmm.
before the COVID pandemic hit.
Yes.
And now I think we're just going to continue to see the longer we go, we're going to continue to see more and more severe long-term effects on the mental and physical health of young people that was caused by the pandemic.
Mhm.
And so if we were to shut down, we would to be dealing with all of that, and I would have to do it, you know, front and center as part of my work. And I'm really scared about being able to meet that challenge.
No, I agree. I agree 100% with you, because I even think about the first time that we shut down, and like going back to, you had talked about the mental health and the physical health, and seeing the because I program for alcohol and other drugs, and
Yeah.
at A&M, and that was a huge thing, was the increase in alcohol use, as well as the um, increased risk of relationship violence or domestic violence, because you're inside
Mhm.
basically with your partner, or with and I think that's without thinking about my own mental health, my own physical health, and all that. I think about other individuals that are in those situations where it's like I said, like those coping strategies. We've been through 17, 18 months of this, and you had that like little glimmer and that little glimpse of, hey, like we're almost good. We're
Mhm.
not great, but we're almost good. And I think now we're seeing that kind of being pulled away from us. And I think that I would even say, and this is my own hypothetical guess here, my scientific hypothesis, um, is that it might be worse the second time around. If that was the case, if this was to happen, even if it was, let's say, like we didn't go back to 100% shutdown, but if we went to like a 75% shutdown, or
I think the mental health side of things definitely has the possibility of being worse because it's like it's been so hard to keep up our resiliency to get to this point. And like I can't imagine telling I have a some really dear friends who have a yes, almost an 11-year-old now who, and I cannot fathom telling an 11-year-old, let alone a 17-year-old, that they have to go back to this thing that change the world and how you communicate with people.
mhm,
And so you take all of that. Yeah, I mean, it's not surprising in the least that alcohol abuse went up. There was a CDC study that really floored me, where it was like even by July of 2020, I think it was 1 out of 4 traditional college age students had considered suicide, and it's like, what do you do? How do you respond? And so you think about how hard it is has got to be for so many students even to just go off to a physical campus
mhm.
with this idea that they're going to come quote unquote back to normal, right? And be on campus like that. I've been talking to a lot of students and a lot of parents who are very nervous about that for, based on medical conditions, disabilities, or just flat out, my student had never experienced anxiety before, until
Yeah.
the pandemic, and then they were told to stay inside or else.
Mhm.
And so the long term effects. And then if we have to, I don't know. And I don't know that it'll be clear really as it was. It felt like there was like an on and off switch where like we weren't really caring about the pandemic, and then suddenly, okay, time to go home. The first
Yeah.
time, and I feel like now it's so there's it's not so much of a binary now. Or if it has to go back to something, it's not going to be so much of a binary, and that makes it even scarier.
No, you were not wrong, and I think that that's a valid point. I had never really I thought about that, but I never really like you saying that, like, is frightening.
Oh,
um
glad I could help your happiness in higher ed podcast.
I mean, I appreciate it. I appreciate it. But I mean, it also, it's like we've talked about. It's that piece of knowing that it could happen. Because I think that was the big thing with what happened the first time around is we didn't take the time to process what happened. It was kind of just like, and that's what started that when you talk about I talked about this with Danielle last week about the resiliency and like how it's a tank and how we never really had that opportunity to fill up on that tank because it's just been consistently, 16, 17, 18 months of just going.
Because we never encountered any of that before. So how could we know when to take a break or when to build up that tank?
Yep. And it kind of goes to like even a deeper concept of like the consumerism and capitalism and how taking a break isn't necessarily seen as a good thing. Like it's seen as kind of like you're being lazy or it's a derogatory thing. And in a pandemic, like you needed to take as much rest as humanly possible because, just and like the easiest way to say it is like just existing is a lot, because of everything that we talked about.
Yeah. Well, that leaves me, that is sort of tied into what will be my answer to your self-care question. But
No, that's totally fine. Cause I mean, I feel like we talked about a little bit of like the resilience, but I mean, what are some of the things that kept you resilience and some of the challenges that happened?
I mean, the Los Angeles Dodgers winning the World Series was something, and I believe that was legitimate. On the contrary to what you were trying to tell me as began. Um, but no, there were some artistic projects. I actually wrote a play over the pandemic that's meant to be over Zoom. It's about two people who meet and fall in love just over Zoom and never meet each other in person. And
Okay.
that was a real. It was something to work on and to carry me forward and to work towards.
Mhm.
Um, and like the things that were goal oriented, I guess, were the things that I found most resilient making.
Mhm.
Um, and then, you know, uh, then in terms of, I guess the self care stuff, I didn't really take good care of my physical or mental health for most of, if not all of the pandemic. But one thing that I became a real hardliner about was my non-working hours.
Mhm.
And that's something that we can talk about when we get there, but I don't want to. I feel like I made this more of a free flowing conversation than the podcast ever has been. So I want to follow your format.
No, 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 no. I have enjoyed every single second of this because I think that I wanted this to be more about the guest. Like I wanted to give individuals a platform to have these conversations and to start that spark over again, I guess.
Well, I appreciate it, and it's funny because it strikes me that I haven't really had too many of these conversations. Like I've talked to my parents, my family members, good friends about
Mhm.
the big stuff, the big issues that the pandemic created, but I haven't really talked to anybody in higher ed to this length
Mhm.
about how it affected us. But yeah, in terms of the being a hardliner, it's it's so funny because when we were in grad school, I was always so grateful to not be working in housing because I had seen all these people in housing who need to be, hang on to the duty phone all weekend, and
Mhm.
it's a live-in position, and it's just like I could never do that. But we were all kind of working in a living position over the pandemic.
Yeah, no, you're not wrong. You're very. That's very true.
And yeah, and so and also just due to the nature of the thing, like the fact that like I said earlier, we get contacted when when students perceive a problem that needs solving.
Hmm.
And so there's always going to be more emails in the inbox, right? There's always going to be more voicemails. There's always going to be there's always going to be more that you could be doing.
Hmm.
And, you know, you'll kill yourself if you try and do that stuff.
Hmm.
And so be having a real hard line in terms of when the working day ends for me, not checking the emails after hours, taking my weekends, not checking emails on weekends. I at one point even just like I guess it was like right at the beginning or right before the 2020-2021 school year started.
Hmm.
Week of vacation time. Didn't go anywhere. Where was I going to go? But I took a vacation time because I needed it.
Hmm.
And I just needed to step away from the inbox and the chats and all of the Zoom calls and just do other things. And that's something that I really cherish now that I'm back on campus
Hmm.
and working a more traditional in a more traditional physical based uh expectation or job or whatever.
Hmm.
um you know, having that off time, using that vacation time,
Hmm.
like use all of your vacation time. Like that is something that that I have vowed to myself for the future is I'm going to use all my vacation time. I'm going to use all my personal days. Like it's just that stuff is there for a reason.
Yeah.
And you know, weekends are there for a reason. And off hours on Tuesday nights are there for a reason. And so
Yeah.
it's like those are things that that's the primary way that I have really consciously cared for myself uh, as a higher ed professional, but also over the course of the pandemic.
Yeah, no, and that's honestly that's awesome, and that's amazing. I mean, it's hard to say that that had to happen because of a pandemic, but I think that it's even the realization and like doing that is amazing because I think what you had touched on specifically that I think about all the time is how many of us have like emails on our phone or have anything work related on our phone, because I think it just becomes another heightened thing from the pandemic is how connected we are and like how we're always doing things on our phone and like it blurs those lines of, oh, I'm just going to check my email, or it's the Saturday, I'm going to clear my inbox, but then all of a sudden you find something that you need to respond to or that you should respond to, and then it's like it's just that thought process of like always being on. And I think that when I started the job at A&M, that was the biggest thing for me is I was like, this is a hard boundary that I'm going to have. I don't want to have anything related on my phone. And I can understand once you get up to those bigger level positions, like eventually, like I want to become a dean of students. So like, I know at a certain point that like, that's going to be a hard line that is going to be like, if we call, you need to, step into action type situation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but if they really needed something, that they would call me. And I think to this day, even though I'm coming up on a year at A&M, like that is the one thing that has probably saved me, because in grad school, like you had mentioned beforehand, is like everything was like, oh, I'm like answering emails about like schoolwork, but then it's also work stuff, and it's just kind of like it's all intertwined, and like that housing situation, um yeah, it's just a lot. Like
And I don't know that it's such a great thing for human beings to be so virtually connected as we are anyway.
Mhm.
You know, I'm a lot more reliant on screens than I ever was for the first 20 years of my life. And I, those weren't a horrible 20 years. Like, you know,
Mhm.
and so, but yeah, no, I have the apps. I have Outlook and Microsoft Teams on my phone, but I turn the notifications off.
Okay.
If I need to check it, I will check it. I'll check I'll see my schedule for the next day, just to prepare for how late I can sleep or whatever. But,
Yeah,
but,
no.
it's really been it's really something I encourage anybody in higher ed, or certainly anyone in student affairs, to do, is try and build those limits. And it's
Yeah.
hard because a lot of us work in offices or in uh, functional areas where if we take a week off, then we know that we're going to come back to 75 emails that need to be read, in cases that need to be dealt with. So it's like either way, we're going to fall behind.
Yeah.
And I totally get that when that there's always the consequence of falling behind, it gets harder to be such a hardliner
Hmm.
and set aside your own time.
Yeah, no, definitely. It is a I'm trying to think of the word, but it's like a tightrope. It's a hard balance sometimes. It definitely is.
Yeah.
But so I got one last question for you. So, what is the one piece of advice you live by in your practice?
So I really want to pull out a Chase Catalano quote right now. Who was on which episode? If we want
I believe it was number 3. I think it was number 3.
to. Okay. Okay. Yeah, no, I can't think of anything right now. Honestly, this was the question I preparing. I didn't really have an answer to.
Okay.
Um, there is something that I find myself thinking about, or have found myself thinking about, in student affairs whenever it gets so I'm a big empath. I really am good or bad, whatever you might whatever you might consider good or bad,
Hmm.
at taking on the emotions of others. And it's something that I've always done, and it's something that has always been very instinctual for me. And I'm, a pretty emotional guy anyway, and I come from the arts. It's like it's all about emotion, right?
Hmm.
But I keep going back to basically the first thing that every freshman acting class teaches their acting majors, which is acting is actually not about the emotion. If I'm in a scene with you and we're going back and forth, and the whole time, all I'm thinking about is, I have to be sad now. First of all, how does one get there? Like, if I'm just thinking, I have to be sad now, maybe
Hmm.
I'll do some tears, but that'll be totally artificial. And if that's all I'm thinking about, the scene from the audience's perspective is going to be wax paper, thin,
Hmm.
nothing. What you do, instead of playing the emotion, is you play the action, because that's not only more effective, not only more palpable to the audience, but it's also how we live our lives. Like, if I'm trying to get something from you, I don't pre- you know focus on my emotions. I focus on, how am I going to get something from you.
Hmm.
And so, if you play the action, you are fighting for something, and you're actually being proactive. You're actually doing something. And you may well have an emotional reaction to it. I might be fighting so hard for something that you're not giving me that it makes me cry.
Hmm.
But then, I can't control that. If you just think that the emotion is going to be what it's going to be, it'll happen organically, and I'm just going to roll with it, and you focus more on what is achievable or what you're trying to achieve, it's going to be a stronger performance. It's going to make more sense to the audience, and it's going to be something that you can really sink your teeth into and do.
Hmm.
And that is something that I find myself coming back to in my practice in student affairs, especially because I talk a lot with students who have mental health conditions, and that we didn't even talk about disability services that much, but it's like the vast majority of students right now who are receiving disability accommodations at the college level are doing so for mental health, um, and learning disabilities too, but for non-physical disabilities.
Hmm.
But so I'm talking every day to 5 students who have, all different kinds of mental health conditions. And I'm Mr. Empath. So it's like if if I just focused on the emotional reaction, I wouldn't be serving my student well, because I wouldn't be doing my job focusing on what is actually the accessibility issue at hand, and what can I do in my purview as a disability resource professional to remove the barriers and make the environment more accessible. And that's what I have to do. And some days it's easier than others. And some days I kind of wish that I was just a mental health therapist, because that's where I see the problem being these days. And some days I'm like, my God, I couldn't function as a human being if I did something like that, because such an empath.
Hmm.
But I guess that's the advice that I keep coming back to is, the emotional reaction is going to be what it's going to be. I need to focus on what the actual job is and what I can do and how best I can serve the student. And if we both end up crying, so be it.
Wow. That yes. Yes. That was awesome. No, that's very good. And I think that I've heard of that, but I've never heard of it in that experience or that light, and like using that the acting experience. Um but that's awesome. That is
Well, thank you. I didn't come up, but it's,
no, no, I yeah. I
no.
but I yeah.
Well, and it was that was one of the first moments of remembrance or realization in my student affairs master's program, where I was like, "Oh wow, I can actually bring my show business past into this current work."
Hmm.
So for any of y'all out there who are considering a career change into the world of higher ed, but you're doubting yourself because of what you previously did, I guarantee you can bring whatever your baggage is to the work,
Hmm.
and be better at it for it.
Yeah. No, I think that it's those transferable skills. Those transferable skills are amazing. And I think that it's just your outlook on what your past experiences are.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and
so
let the instructors and the professors be the experts at the one thing that they're talking about.
mhm,
Like student affairs professionals, we're dealing with life to more of an extent,
mhm,
and all of that encompasses. So we should have as many transferable skills as possible. We should have we should know different regions of California and be able to talk to students about where they're from,
mhm.
like just it's more multifaceted. There's
Yeah.
more, I don't know, room for exploration. I don't know what you want to say, but but it, there's more of that, and that's something that I'm continue to be drawn to.
Yeah. No, that's
Yeah,
awesome.
yeah.
Well, that
What else?
is
So I can keep going for like.
I know you can. And but we're almost at 50 minutes here. So yeah, so I just want to say thank you for being on here, and thank you for I really enjoyed this. I think that this is great. I've never really been asked questions, so I think that was awesome.
Well,
So
I'm happy to do that for you, John. And I really, I said that I've listened to the podcast. I have enjoyed it previously. I was really excited to get that email from you and be a part of this, and because it is a like it's one thing to be a hardliner about your schedule and when you're going to check your emails. It's another thing in such a service oriented business
mhm,
to think about what makes us happy, what gives us joy in it,
mhm,
when it's so much about other people and the hustle and all that stuff. It's like it when it feels like the expectation is it's a competition to see who's got more hustle or who puts themselves down at the for the sake of the job and the students.
mhm.
Focusing on the joy is actually a kind of a radical act, and I'm really excited to see where the podcast goes.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes two of us. So, but yeah, no, thank you once again. I appreciated this. I appreciated this conversation. So, and to our followers out there, don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube as well as like our videos, and don't forget to like us or follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So, yeah, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. So.